In a distributed world, you have to optimize for the speed of knowledge retrieval. How fast can person A and person B tap into a knowledge system and extract the information that they need when they need it, independent of whether each other is online at the same time? This is how the internet works. When you're at home and you have a plumbing issue, you hop on YouTube and you retrieve how to fix this. This is a much more efficient way than waiting until the next day when you can phone someone or walk to someone's plumbing shop, tap them on the shoulder, and get that same information.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. The Flex Index represents more than 7,500 companies, 50,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Today, my guest is Darren Murph. Darren is the head of tech strategy communications at Ford and took GitLab public as head of remote work. He was called an oracle of remote work by CNBC, included in the Forbes Future of Work 50, and a LinkedIn top voice on remote work. In this episode, we'll dig into how GitLab scaled remote work to become the first public, fully remote company, what best practices they learned along the way that other companies can pattern, and what red flags to avoid to enable a better remote work operating model. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable, and it also helps new listeners find the podcast. Darren, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Darren, I was looking through your background and kind of like remembering the different things that you've done over time in anticipation for this conversation. And I forgot, or maybe I just hadn't realized, that you were the points guy at one point, which is like the coolest thing. And I don't think I've ever talked to you about that.
It's very cool. That was such a beautiful season of life. That's when my wife and I moved forward on adoption. Our adoption journey began in that season of life. So I'll never forget that season because it was wrapped around travel and aviation and becoming a parent. So all of those are intertwined. It really started from a hobby perspective. I was always a points and miles junkie. If you know what that is, you know what that is. If not, go to the points guy and find out. Lots of fun trips enabled by points and miles. And I've always been a helper. And that was an opportunity for me to do what I love, but also help other people enjoy that hobby.
Well, look, I love that publication. I can't think of how many times a random question that I searched for ended me on some long thread on Points Guy on which credit card I should pick or which airline does the best value when you're going this place. And so thank you for your service and contributions in that area.
Of course, happy to do it.
Darren, you, I think of as one of the OG remote people in the sense that you've been thinking around this space for a while, and the contributions that you've made at GitLab, not just to like the way that organizations think about this, but the psychology of work, I think is really tremendous. One of the things I'm curious about, and I don't know if we've ever talked about, is why remote? Like, how did you get so into this, and why was it something that was worth investing so much, energy into?
My red pill moment. So that dates me a bit, but in the Matrix.
But such a fantastic reference, though.
Red pill moment, where if you take the red pill, you go down one rabbit hole. If you take the blue pill, you go down another rabbit hole. So the red pill moment for me was this recognition that, at least in Western society, most people early in life are pressured into answering the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then they never stop to think about the context around it. They simply feel pressured to answer that question. And then at some point, they let an HR team tell them where they're going to be in the world in order to be that thing they want it to be. And people just do it. They don't question it. I could never square this. This always seemed like absolute mania to me. And it was going about it backwards. So the way my brain works was, what kind of lifestyle do I want to have? What kind of community do I want to be around? Who is the person I want to be? And then I back into what type of professional arrangement will enable me to maximize my leverage in that capacity. And so that was the approach I took very early on. I knew that I was great at storytelling. I knew that marketing and comms, building teams, people strategy, at that nexus is where I thrived. And so I found teams and found people who were willing to be a bit more progressive on letting me be wherever I needed to be so long as the results were delivered. So it was a simple concept, my red pill moment. I didn't want to let an HR team tell me where I had to be in order to be who I knew I could be.
I think it's so interesting that you found that so not resonant in a way, right? Because, like when you growing up and me growing up and generations of work before us, we're all born out of this idea that, there's this inextricable linkage between work and place, and you have a certain type of work and it's done at a certain location. Why didn't it sit with you, given all of that kind of like societal context and breeding around that being the way we think about it?
I think a lot of it had to do with my generation and where I was in my life arc at the intersection of where the internet was in its life arc. And once I understood the power of well-connected networks, you can't unsee something like the internet. And my thesis is very simple. Mankind invented the internet, so why shouldn't we leverage it to live better, more flexible lives? It really comes down to that. Now, if you think in a pre-internet era, of course, work needed to be completely linked to location because how else do you communicate, collaborate, and deliver results? But as soon as that began to break down and there was a better, more flexible way to do it, I said, why not? And so I started pushing the boundaries of what can be done digitally. And come to find out, a lot of knowledge work doesn't require you to be in the same physical place as other people. That's not to say there's not tremendous benefit to intentionally gathering and getting together at certain moments, but you don't have to uproot your life and march into the same door every day for the same hours. We're beyond that.
Yeah. I think the internet and the way you framed it is really interesting. And one of the things I think I was looking at this maybe just the other day because we were doing some work on a report on professional services companies. And I was curious if younger professional services companies approached flexibility differently than companies that were formed in the 80s or 90s, for example. And in professional services, similar to a lot of other industries, we saw this step change in the percentage of companies that were embracing flexibility, and on top of that, full flexibility. So no office requirement. And it started in 2000. Basically, the 1990 to 2000 vintage was really different than the 2000 to 2010 vintage. And the 2010 beyond vintage was significantly different still. And my hypothesis had been you just grow up with a different set of technology, right? Like the PC to the internet to the smartphone collaboration software, video conference, right? Like that really does color your perspective on the world based on the technology you grew up around you.
The framing of technology is very important here because you could go back in history and ask, well, once the automobile was invented, why didn't you keep using the horse and buggy? Well, a new technology, a new product was invented. And so people figured out a way to integrate it into their life. And the same is true with the internet. Remember, telework or telecommuting has actually been around a very long time, but we were able to put language around work from home and remote work in a bit more modern times once mass adoption of broadband became available.
Yeah. And I mean, in the auto example you gave is obviously a pretty resonant one, given what you do, today. I believe, at Ford, you're responsible for technology communications, right? And so what does that mean in practice, and how do those things start to come together for you?
Yeah, my current role is at this ideal sweet spot of marketing and comms, but also developing and building a new team. The automotive industry as a whole is going through massive amounts of transformation. So, of course, that includes transforming how we think about how work happens within that context. So it's been a lot of fun. I grew up in a Ford racing family. Automotive runs in the veins. And so getting to tackle both of those challenges at once is a great opportunity.
That's awesome. So one of the things I want to spend some time with you talking about, and I think a lot of our listeners would probably be pretty interested in, is you were pretty formative at GitLab in thinking through what is our remote work strategy? How do we approach this on the road from GitLab being a smaller company to being a public company, if I recall correctly? I think GitLab is an example that a lot of people are familiar with, but may not know the ins and outs on and how that was approached in some of those discussions. And so I'd love for you to take me through that and kind of where was it at when you joined? How did that start to evolve? Like, help me kind of like paint that picture a little bit.
Early in 2019, I got a phone call from someone who was working at a company called GitLab. Now, mind you, I'd never heard this term before in my life, but it only took a few minutes in the phone call for her to say something like, "We don't have any offices. All of our people work from wherever they are. We have people in dozens of countries." And I had to physically take a seat because I knew in my mind the quality of life improvement going from something that was a haphazard hybrid model with no intentionality to a fully remote, fully intentional model would be a significant change. And so essentially at that point, I was sold. Whatever you want me to do, I want to work here because this is super rare. I ended up talking with Sid Sibrandy, the CEO, and I remember him saying, if we do this right, we will become the first officeless company to IPO. It has never happened before. And I was in at that point. So I joined the company, helped evolve what is still a world-leading blueprint on how to think about work in a distributed fashion. And so we built that, we evolved it, we marketed it. It was an open source company, open core company. So we were transparently sharing what we learned with the world in the remote playbook. Over the course of a couple of years, over 150,000 different leaders and teams had downloaded that. So the fingerprints
That's an
are
amazing statistic.
all over the world. It has truly transformed how people think about distributed work. And in October of 2021, I was there at the NASDAQ Tower, broadcasting live to the world, not just our team, to the world, transparently, whoever wanted to watch, the first live streamed IPO of the first officeless company to ever reach that milestone. And it's a big deal. It's a big deal now, but it will only become a bigger deal. And here's why. The world of remote work and distributed work, the language is evolving, was always put in a box. You would hear things like, hey, that's cute, but it can't scale, or that's cute, but it's only for technology companies. The list of boxes that it was put in was so long. That moment was the breakthrough for every company, every leader who always knew that there was a different way to do it, but there was not really an authentic way to showcase that. GitLab became the authenticity card for anyone who wanted to think about work differently. And look at where we are now. In 2023 and beyond, every company to some degree is a distributed company. Even if your company doesn't identify as remote, work is happening on the internet. Your clients are not in the same city as you. Your partners are not in the same city as you. And even if you have two different buildings, those buildings are remote to each other. If you're in one building but on multiple floors, those floors are remote to one another. So the first principles of distributed work are really just great principles for modern work. And I hope that's where we can get the narrative globally.
That's so well put. And what's interesting about what you just described is it sounds like the company and the CEO, GitLab, were already pretty adamant around where they wanted to be and the journey they were on. And I'm curious, you told me a little bit, a few minutes ago, why this is important to you personally and some of the elements around that. What made it part of the company's DNA? Like, what was it about, like about remote work or the founder or the team that's like, hey, look, this is not just something that we're going to embrace, but we want to be world leading and the first company to go public and kind of like set the paradigm for the future in that way?
A couple of important points to unpack. One is that when you intentionally choose a model, it's much easier to then build and scale around that model than it is to choose one model and then have COVID up in that. And then you have to change your model mid-flight. So GitLab decided it wanted to be a fully remote company from day one, which enabled a ton of acceleration on how we were able to evolve that. The quick story of why this happened is the first 3 employees were in 3 different countries. They didn't want to all come together in one country. It just organically happened. There was a brief moment after Y Combinator where everyone was in an office, but after a few weeks, people just stopped showing up and the work kept getting done. And so the decision was made at that point, hey, let's get the world's best talent to come work here, not convince people to come to a specific place. When you say it like that, you understand the limitations that were broken just by that one decision. On
By
the
the way, that's half of the way that we ended up in New York, my wife and I, because she said, there's no way I'm going to Atlanta, where I'm from. And I said, I'm not going to Chicago. And so, it kind of like makes it a little bit easier that way.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful thing that it can happen. 100 years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. So we have used technology to break through compromise. Now, on the personal side, why this matters to me, I mentioned this adoption journey. I think back to that journey and how seamless and effortless it was, largely because I was working for a flexible employer. So if we needed to have a meeting at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday, we can do that. I can work in a non-linear fashion. My organizational structure is built to accommodate these types of things. And I had this aha moment at some point along the journey during COVID. And I thought, if tens of millions of people are enabled to work remotely or more flexibly coming out of this, if even a fraction of those reapply that recaptured time and energy to something that is important to them, we could solve major problems in the world. And for me, what I'm passionate about is the orphan crisis. Think about how many people would foster or adopt, but they say, my job is too rigid or I can't find time. Well, if you're working remotely, suddenly with no additional infrastructure or lobbying, you have that time back. It can make a big dent in a global crisis. So for me, this is much more important than is someone in the office or not. I'm thinking about the second and third order effects of how this changes the fabric of society, how we can support one another. Why are we not leveraging technology to live better lives, to help one another? The global conversation around this is not there yet. We're still trying to figure out, how does work happen? What does efficiency look like? What does productivity look like? But I'm being patient with that narrative. I hope that we can get to those second or third order conversations sooner rather than later.
Did you appreciate the importance of what you just described around orphans? And I think about, by the way, that I would extend that as something that you really pick up as a young parent, right? Or a parent of young kids for the first time. Like, I think this, like I have a 1-month-old right now and a 2-year-old, and going through that experience significantly changed my perspective on work flexibility and what it means to be home or not, and the gaps in the US, for example, around childcare and windows, and how do you foot that with the hours you're supposed to be in the office. Did you identify with that differently based on that circumstance and kind of like becoming a parent in that way? And do you think, how do you create that connection for people who maybe haven't seen it firsthand in the same fashion?
It's very interesting you mentioned that. It actually started earlier in life, but because of remote work. So my wife and I were married 12 years before we became parents. But in those 12 years, I worked flexibly. I worked remotely. I was able to travel the world, over 50 countries. I saw all 50 US states. I was able to see things that people who are locked in a rigid 9 to 5 simply don't see. And actually, at some point during those journeys, you see enough need where this thing happened for us, where we thought, if ever we're going to grow our family, we have to be a part of the solution. There is a ton of need in the world that we were exposed to because we had the flexibility to get out there and see it. So the question becomes, how do you replicate that for people? It's really hard. You really have to get out there and see it. Obvious things are only obvious to whom they are obvious, and people don't know what they don't know. And it's why I encourage people who now have the privilege of working remotely, don't just copy and paste your office 9 to 5 into your home. Experiment with doing things differently. Your peak productivity curve might not be 9 to 5. There might be some community engagements you can get involved with at different times of the day and then work a little earlier or later or on the weekend. Design your life, be more dynamic. People have been so consumed by the box that they have to put work in that it's very difficult for many of them to open their minds enough to experiment and try things differently.
What I think is so fascinating about what you just said, Darren, is there's such a discussion around loneliness and the epidemic of loneliness, and it's started to be written about. And I think the U.S. government or some U.S. government agency, I think, is talked about as being an epidemic of loneliness. And there's a not insignificant set of people who say, "Look, well, remote work is hurting this, and people aren't leaving their house." But in some ways, what you're describing is the opportunity for the opposite, right? Which is like, let let the opportunity to work flexibly free you and experience things that maybe you never would have had the chance to, versus allowing it to make you retrench back into kind of like never leaving your home. And I think that's probably different than how a lot of people think about the opportunity around remote work.
For sure. And this really gets into the psychology of work and the identity that it has been associated with in people's lives. What I'm seeing on the other side of COVID is that people's identity stacks or their purpose portfolio is being reordered in a major way. And when you think about remote work and flexible work, it enables you to reprioritize who you are, what your identity is, what gives you joy and fulfillment and purpose. And work will, of course, play a part in that. But when you can reorder how you spend the hours in your day, that is immensely powerful. And it is a massive missed opportunity if people just copy the same 9 to 5. But of course, the friction here, the tension is, well, I need an organization that will design systems that enable me to design a different life. And this is really at the heart of where I think a lot of organizations get this wrong. They are misdiagnosing remote work as a perk or a policy, something that can be handled in a HR-led one-pager. It is not that. It is an operating model that requires an architect and a team of minds thinking about every element of how work happens when people aren't in the same place at the same time. And so for companies that are retreating on remote work and they're issuing return to office mandates, how much of it is we didn't put in the right effort to actually architect this as an operating model? We tried to get away with it being a policy or a perk, and we're underwhelmed with the results.
I wonder if part of that is a refusal in certain corners of organizations to believe that this is permanent. And it's a lot easier to think about this as a policy or underinvesting in the relative infrastructure or support, so to speak, in the way you described it. If you are not totally emotionally bought in on the fact that this is not just where we are today, but like this is where we're going to be, and therefore we've got to make the the commensurate investments to get that right.
Yeah, I love Charlie Munger's speech on the psychology of human misjudgment. If you have not heard this, Google it. It is an hour well spent. One of these human misjudgments is what's called social proof tendency. And so what you're seeing is a lot of leaders are looking at a lot of other leaders and they're simply doing what the others do. And you actually saw this in the pandemic when many organizations who were not yet equipped to go fully remote did so because a lot of other organizations were doing it, not because they put intentional thought and asked, is this the best thing for us? And now it's happening again in reverse, the social proof tendency. When you see other organizations do something, you feel compelled to react. And the psychology of this really unpacks why this happens. And you see a lot of people that are looking at the news and thinking, this is lunacy, this is mania. It is. It is a key consideration for human misjudgment, but it happens every day.
So it sounds like, if I think about what you just said, and I think about the description that you gave of GitLab and how it grew up before you got there, step one is like an intentionality, if you will, right? Like this is what we want to do. And it's not just what we want to do today, it's what we're committed to doing. Beyond that, tell me a little bit or help paint the picture of where was GitLab at when you joined? So what was the scale? How was it operating? And then how big was it, when you went public and when you left? So as we talk about this in a minute, some of the things you put in place, people can understand kind of like what you were scaling through and how you kind of had to make it work at different sizes.
GitLab was roughly 700 people in a few dozen countries when I joined. And at IPO, we were roughly 1,700 people in over 60 countries.
So you had 1,000 people over that 2-year period.
Correct. Yeah. And the other anecdote I'll give you here is when I joined, the GitLab remote handbook, by the way, is fully transparent. It's legendary. The remote operations section of that handbook was around 5 pages when I joined. It was 50 when I left. So a 10x over 4 years. And that became the blueprint of what we shared in the remote playbook and blasted it out to the world. So every possible element of our operational footprint, we thought about, we codified, we wrote it down, and we distributed it. The secret of all of this is making the implicit explicit. and you have to rethink what you optimize for. Most organizations optimize for the speed of knowledge transfer, as in how fast can person A in an office with person B tap them on the shoulder and exchange information. In a distributed world, you have to optimize for the speed of knowledge retrieval. How fast can person A and person B tap into a knowledge system and extract the information that they need when they need it, independent of whether each other is online at the same time? This is how the internet works. When you're at home and you have a plumbing issue, you hop on YouTube and you retrieve how to fix this. This is a much more efficient way than waiting until the next day when you can phone someone or walk to someone's plumbing shop, tap them on the shoulder, and get that same information. Humans know how to do this. We now have to apply this to the world of work.
So, in a way, it sounds like part of the process is stripping out human dependency in terms of where do you go to get answers or go figure some stuff out. Like, if I think about, it's scoop at different stages or different sizes over time. It's like, okay, if I want to go get the answer to how this problem works or how the system works, oh, Joe's the person, like go find Joe and talk to them, right? And then we invariably ended up with this issue where it's like, well, Joe can't get any work done because every time Joe tries to sit down, 30 people are saying, hey, Joe, you're the expert on this. So it sounds like you're, maybe a different way of putting it, like you're trying to pull the bus factor, to take a technical term, out of any person so that people can go find their own stuff without having to go tap someone on the shoulder to get it.
There's a lot of truth to that. And this helps to put yourself in the engineering mindset, which is the person who documents the best becomes the most hallowed person in the group. So it's not, hey, let's go to Joe, the person, and get something out of Joe in real time. It's how great is Joe's documentation? Joe has documented problems, solutions, builds it out. There's as much effort put into the paperwork of work than work itself. And this is a big mental shift for people, but think about it. This is how civilizations have scaled over millennia. We write the important things down so that the next generation has a baseline and then they can evolve and iterate. If you don't codify anything, you're reinventing the wheel time and time again. And so I would argue that it's not quite taking the human out of it. It is removing the inefficiency of never codifying the innovation that comes from the human mind.
Did the fact that, maybe put a different way, because of what GitLab does, did it make it easier for the organization to say, hey, look, let's be very documentation oriented and make that a central part of how we think about operating?
The simple answer is yes. It helps that GitLab is not manufacturing hardware. If you run an oil change facility, for example, this becomes much more difficult. You need people in the bays ready when people show up. So this does not work for every work type. But interestingly, there are pockets of work, legal teams, communications teams, marketing teams within any function, even at manufacturing companies, that could stand to do things slightly differently. I think the important part to realize here is that the media narrative has made this very binary, very divisive, very one side or the other. That's the media business. It's how it has always worked. But the truth is, this is much more nuanced. Of course, there are trade-offs to doing things fully distributed, but there are also trade-offs to buying a skyscraper in a city and forcing your whole workforce to come there. It's about acknowledging the trade-offs and recognizing that some work happens better in some formats versus another. But choosing to pull the past into the present just seems like a suboptimal strategy, no matter what side you're currently on.
Was GitLab good at this, great at this, amazing at this from a documentation perspective when you got there? Like, how much work had to go into kind of improving or kind of building upon that beyond just what you described in terms of adding pages to the documentation around remote itself?
They were the best I have personally ever seen at this. The onboarding was incredibly codified. Honestly, it started before you even joined. The company strategy is written down. So you can understand if the company resonates with you from a values perspective before you even apply. You don't even have to have a 30-minute conversation with someone to understand that. That is remarkable. And so the foundation was solid. All kudos to Sid for having this vision early on that we can work differently. It's just amazing and fascinating to think about what went in to that early idea that then scaled very easily.
If you're an organization that is not oriented that way from the start, how do you start to get better at documentation? Can one person do that? Does it require kind of a broader cultural buy-in to actually start to move down that path?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways you can approach it. There's the rip the band-aid approach, which is we're building a team around installing a knowledge management system, a way of working, and then we shout it from every rooftop that we possibly can. And then you actively stop other ways of working. So a great example of this is if you want your synchronous time to be well spent, you don't want people presenting in synchronous time. You want them making the presentation, recording it, and then using synchronous times for question and answer, things that are really high fidelity. How do you do this? Well, senior leaders show up in meetings, someone starts to present, and you just say, hey, this isn't how this meeting works. We'll reconvene next week. When you start doing things like that, the rip to band-aid approach off can be very effective. Then the other approach is start small and combine it with what not to do. The truth is, the list of what to do is so long. I mean, remember, this is an entire operating model. You're re-architecting the entire way work gets done. That is an enormous task. So it's easier to start with what do we not do? What are the red flags? So that when we start doing those things, I have this reaction of, ooh, I should do something differently. Combined with small things like, hey, we're going to go through our meeting calendar, and anything that has the title of FYI or status update, we're going to remove those, and we're going to inject an agenda where people can now use documentation to keep people in the loop. Small baby steps have a big approach or a big impact in helping rewire people's brains so they don't fall into the tendency of just doing it the way it's always been done.
So those are two pretty good red flags you already raised, right? Like one is, are we using synchronous time to present information that people could have read or not have presented to them in that way? Are we using status updates that could have been done asynchronously and turning them into meetings? Any other, either from GitLab or other companies you worked with over time, like very obvious red flags that people can go away tomorrow and say, hey, look, I can try and cut some of this stuff out and at least move myself further down the path here?
The more I really dig into transformation at work, the more I appreciate how the human brain works. And so if you're listening to this and you have this big change management project ahead of you, it's so easy to get focused on what are the small wins or what are the tactics. But I would advise you to actually take a step back and first understand the human mentality of the people that this will impact. One of the most profound things that I've studied lately is Dr. David Rock's Your Brain at Work. This is an amazing book. And in it, he lays out this model called the SCARF model. S is for status, C is for certainty, A is for autonomy, R is for relatedness, and F is for fairness. And in it, he argues that in every social dynamic, all five of these elements are in play. And at any moment, you are moving either toward threat or toward reward on all five of those dynamics. And so when you think about ripping the Band-Aid off or implementing a knowledge management system or massively changing the way something works, go down that list and think, the people that will be impacted, is this going to move them closer to a reward state? How do we look at their status and see that it gets better through this change? How do we make sure that they can relate to this so they're not terrified of it? How can we make sure that it feels fair? How can we make sure that this gives people more agency and autonomy? By the way, this is why these RTO mandates are having a lot of issues, because you're putting people in a state of threat on their autonomy range. And so when you start understanding that every human brain...
And fairness, by the way, I would say, in terms of, I saw an example the other day, I won't name the company, but everyone needs to come back 3 days a week except for group A, B, C, D, E, who invariably have some special skill or status, et cetera. They do not, which I think also probably impacts perception on these things.
Correct. And that's not to say that every policy you have will be 100% fair. That's probably impossible. But acknowledging it helps the relatedness factor, that even if something will feel a little unfair, if you acknowledge it, now at least it's more relatable. And so on the whole, if you can move people toward a state of reward, instead of creating an organization or systems that people are threatened by, it helps you move things in the right direction. And not enough organizations are thinking about it. They're looking at data, as in how many people are badging in or how many hours are we spending in meetings. And there's nothing wrong with that. But none of the data connects unless you first address the human psyche around how this impacts their lives, their careers, and all of the experiences wrapped around that.
Yeah, it's interesting because in some ways it's such a simple idea, which is if you're going to make any change within an organization, whether it's yours or somebody else's, for example, because sales processes also kind of work like that in terms of thinking through the motivations and who wins and loses, et cetera. That there's a little bit of thinking there in terms of who's going to be better or worse disposed to digest this before you go embark on a bunch of changes.
Yeah. And the more I look at how these transformations are going down, the more I appreciate transparency. Transparency was a core value at GitLab, and sharing as much as you can early and often goes a long way. People like to be kept in the loop, even if they don't understand it on day one. The earlier that you're transparent about it, the more able they are to contribute thoughts and feelings into shaping what the future holds for them.
So we talked about how GitLab is 700 people or so, roughly, when you joined, about 1,700 at IPO. What worked at 700 when it came to operating fully remote that broke going to 1,700, so people can get a sense of how that scale impacts the model, and what are some of the things you had to do differently as a result to kind of accommodate that next phase of growth?
I'll give you two examples. When I joined the company, I was on what became the last synchronous all hands the company ever had. So I think it was bi-weekly. They would send an invite to every person in the company, so up to 700 people. And a part of that was a small section devoted to welcoming new hires and letting them give a little bit of a spiel. So I got mine in, and then it broke immediately. Once we hit 800, 850 people, we thought, this is just too much. And a lot of this comes to creating a culture where you're not crestfallen every time something evolves. It's this culture of, look, we're growing, we're scaling fast. What got us to where we are might not get us to where we're going. So we're going to need your help in innovating beyond that. So that was one thing. Another thing is getting people together. So at 700 people, it was still possible to do an annual offsite where you could get everyone in the company together. Now, you might have to book out a few hotels, but you could make it work. And by the time I left, yeah, it would still be possible, but is it an enjoyable experience? And so where we landed is one of the most genius ideas I've ever seen implemented at an organization, which was this idea of a get-together grant. So instead of getting everyone together in one centralized place, we provided a stipend to everyone in the company. And then we enabled the trip planners of the organization to figure out trips, to build trips, and then let people opt into the ones that they wanted to experience. Really cool idea. And so what we ended up having is this shared experience, although people were apart. So we had pockets of 10, 20, 30 people at Disneyland or golfing at St. Andrews, the home of golf, all of these things happening around the world, but people were capturing these moments and they were sharing them back in our centralized Slack platform. And at a glance, it was like, whoa, I'm in all of these things all at once, even if I'm physically only at one of those. I think it was a master stroke of genius in bringing people together while recognizing the scaling challenges of getting people in 60 plus countries into one place.
It's pretty brilliant. I love both of those anecdotes. You kind of have to continue to leave no sacred cows, so to speak, in terms of what is synchronous versus asynchronous. And because synchronous time, to your point, becomes more and more expensive the more people involved as a company scales. And I love that decentralization of getting people together. And I've heard so many companies struggle with, well, what's the right cadence of offsites and who should get together when. And a lot of people think about it from a business perspective. Is it more for strategy sessions or planning, et cetera? But one of the more interesting conversations I've had on this podcast was with Raj Chowdhury, who's a professor at HBS, who did some research that basically found that, you know, if you got people together for meaningful social interaction for a couple of days, then for months afterward, their asynchronous workflows would improve in terms of the way they collaborate. And so it's more just about enabling it to be easy to get together in different ways. And I love the trip planner idea so that people don't have to do their own travel booking each time to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, it was crowdsourcing it. We asked people to raise their hands, and turns out there were 20 or 30 people that love doing this stuff and they're great at it. And so instead of it being from a centralized place at the top, we just let the people exercise their passions. One other note that I'll mention here, if you're thinking about getting people together, Chase Warrington, the head of remote at Doist, is one of the best thinkers on this topic. And he has devised this excellent strategy, which he calls the 50-20-30 strategy. Whenever they get their entire team or sub teams together, they dedicate 50% of it as fully unstructured time, 20% of it as fully structured strategy work sessions, and then 30% of the time where you intentionally gather and bond over some activity, cooking class, hiking, something like that. And when some people hear this, they think 50% unstructured time. Like, we're spending a lot of money to get people together, and half the time is just going to be like whatever happens. But think about why you're getting people together. What is most difficult in a distributed setting? Building rapport, building relationships. How do those happen? Hanging out together without anything pressing into your day, unstructured time. And I think this is a marvelous way to look at it. Inevitably, those 50% of the hours go by crazy fast. And then people end up saying, I wish we had more of these. But the thing I would advise here, going back to what not to do, don't schedule an offsite and then program every minute of it. People will come back exhausted and they'll never want to engage in one again.
Yeah, I think that's it's a great framework and an actionable one that people can take away in terms of how to spend that time. Anything else top of mind in terms of things you had to fix or get right as you moved through that stage of scale, or things that you felt like you really did get right that others can learn from in terms of the approach?
I think hiring was so important. We like to say that we hired for values fit, not for culture fit. And that requires companies being really wedded to their values and knowing what those values meant. So if you Google GitLab values, you'll come to the values page, and the 6 core values are important. But what's more important is the operating principles that are codified underneath of those. So collaboration is a value, for example. I guarantee you collaboration means something different to me than it does to you. And so what we did is codified, what does collaboration mean for our company? And we had actionable ways to express those. One of them that's my favorite is short toes. So we said, if you're working on a project and someone gives you feedback on it and they're not from your function or division, you can't slap back at that with long toes. You have to say, hey, I've got short toes. I welcome all feedback. That's what collaboration looks like here. So it became very easy to recognize, am I being collaborated with according to our values or in opposition to our values? That's something that GitLab did early on. They continued to iterate those values. I think companies mostly have values that are words on a wall, things that you generally aspire to during onboarding, but they probably don't shape your day-to-day interactions with people. And that's something that I found incredibly powerful with a company that truly, truly lived by its values.
That's awesome. I think about your experience now, and we talked a little bit earlier about how you're now at such a storied and iconic company, Ford, right? And coming out of this novel, groundbreaking, totally different type of world and experience at GitLab. What are you taking from the GitLab experience to Ford, and which pieces feel applicable to a company of that size and scale and the way they operate, in a way that you think you can kind of like help shift them forward based on the positive experiences you've had?
I'll say this. The great Maya Angelou once said, we're all more alike than we are unalike. And I'm finding that. Going from a smaller, very unique startup to a global iconic brand with over 100 years of legacy, the truth is people are people, and there's a lot more to relate than there is to not. But what I'm taking is there's so much that can be done different in each organization. And it's not like you can copy and paste something. There's not a one size fits all playbook. You take a penny, leave a penny. Ever seen one of those cups? So you take something from other organizations that works, and then you leave it better for someone else if it doesn't work for you. But the key thing that I'm keeping in mind when I think about change is, what is the why? How can I serve up something different, offer up a different way of working, and directly connect it to how people can live better or different lives, have more agency and autonomy in the choices that they uniquely make? If you can connect the why in putting in the effort to do work differently to the output of getting to live your life differently, you have a much greater chance of success. In that David Rock book, he also shared that aha moments are much more influential than duh moments. And so if you're in a leadership position, your focus should be on create the environment where people innovate on their own. They have the aha moments. That inspires change. If you're the best orator in the world and people are tracking, they're following you, it's still an duh moment. You have to create the environment where there's aha moments. So that's what I'm focused on now.
I love that. I think that's great. Two final questions for you. One, for anyone that is listening that is inspired by your journey and the journey that GitLab has taken and is thinking about their fully remote or employee's choice, even, which is I described as you have offices, but maybe people aren't required to go into the office. They can do what they want to. Are there any other people or resources that you would direct them to kind of learn from or pattern best practices of in order to be better at kind of moving through their own journey and their company's journey on this?
Yeah, there's so many resources out there. The GitLab playbook still stands as an amazing asset. It's a very short read. It really opens your mind. There's a couple of Coursera courses that are linked to that as well. So I would say start there. Also look up Culture Gene by Brett and Putter. Amazing framework on how to think differently.
I'm talking to Brett, by the way, next week.
Phenomenal person, great thinker. And the last one I'll give you is Workplaceless. They put together a asynchronous pyramid that has been a phenomenally powerful visual for me as I help people understand what should you leave time for synchronous engagements and where should you change time to asynchronous behaviors. And if you've seen the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's mapped in a very similar fashion. So it tracks well with the brain. But those three are great resources, and I'm sure you'll fall into a rabbit hole after that.
Awesome. And then one final question for you. For anyone who wants to learn more about you and read more of what you're writing or thinking, where would you send them?
LinkedIn is my platform of choice. I'm also on Twitter, but yeah, find me on LinkedIn, give me a follow. And if we've engaged before, send me a connection request. Happy to learn from others.
That's awesome. Darren, this is really fun for me, not only because I just find you so thoughtful and very considerate and reasoned on everything you share, but you have such practical experience and you've been instrumental in helping shape more broadly how do we think about remote work and have been on the cutting edge for a while. So thanks for spending the time. And hopefully everybody really enjoyed getting to hear some of your perspective and learn some of the best practices you've learned along the way.
Very gracious of you. Thanks so much. Godspeed. Be well.
Thank you. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.